Hello everybody. So I was going to talk about how extremist views influence behaviour in both animal and human groups, but for issues similar to Iain's, unfortunately, and I'll explain later, I'm mostly going to focus on animals today, but I'll have a hint towards what we've been doing with humans throughout. And so I work on collective animal behaviour, and we see this all around us. Organisms interacting. And what's really surprising is we really have only a rudimentary understanding of why and also how unrelated organisms, like these schooling fish and flocking birds, even coordinate their behaviour in such a manner. And so there's some really big open questions. And of course, we ourselves are embedded in our own human collective. So this is some Milgram-style work that we've been doing, putting actors in crowds, subtly manipulating subconscious aspects of natural crowd behaviours. But this also characterizes the approach we take, which is a very quantitative approach to studying collective behavior across scales of biological organization. And of course, when we think of humans, we think of our intelligence, and in many, many situations, we are indeed extremely creative and smart and intelligent and capable of complex poetry and so forth. But in other situations, perhaps we're not quite so smart. And so, unbeknown to that person in the lift, wearing that hat, the other people in this elevator are actually actors. The person is not aware of this. And so that's our focal individual in the middle. And you can see he tends to copy those around him. Even to the extent, as you can see, he's looking around and conforming to what others are doing. So under certain circumstances, humans can be subconsciously affected by the behavior of those around them. Now, when we look at the animal world, you can see it's extremely clear that these social interactions, this tendency to do what those around you are doing, is extremely important. And presumably it's important for the functioning and success of these types of animal groups. And in the 1950s, it was thought there must be telepathy or thought transference. But since then, we've developed computational models that, a bit like that person in the elevator, show that relatively local interactions and a tendency to do what others are doing can explain many of the properties that we see. And so this understanding suggests that these groups tend to be self-organized, that it's these relatively local interactions, such as the tendency to avoid collisions, but to be attracted and to align direction with others, that gives rise to many of the aspects of collective behavior we see in nature. And so today I want to talk about leadership and collective decision-making within these types of groups. How do grouping animals make informed, unanimous decisions regarding what to do? And so I'm going to start with some pretty old work first, because this will set the scene for some very new experimental tests. And I'm going to use pictures of fish just because I have them. They're very nice pictures, but we can think much more conceptually about this. You can even think of sort of idea space, as I'll come to later on in my presentation. So some individuals within this group have goal-oriented behavior. They're knowledgeable. They have information that's relevant. For example, this individual may have performed a migration before and the others not. Or it may know that there's food in this direction that the others are not aware of. Okay, so it's a very general model. But does this individual need to signal to others, I know what's going on, follow me? Do others need to recognize each other individually to understand who has information and who does not? Firstly, we have no evidence for these factors within these groups. So how can information be transferred? How can groups make decisions? So to start with, I developed a very simple computational model whereby individuals reconcile their social tendency, that sort of conformity tendency, with their goal-oriented individual personal beliefs, with a continuous weighting term that we call omega. Now, importantly, when I colour in these individuals in bright colours, it's so we can see their internal preferences. But it's only for us. In the model, there's no way of reading the mind of another individual. So the colours are simply to show what's going on. And if, for example, this weighting term is very small, such as shown here, the goal-oriented behavior doesn't have much influence. But if, for example, the individual becomes very strongly opinionated, this weighting term could become higher. And I'll come back to the strength of opinions in a moment. But the first question we wanted to ask is, can information be conveyed without signaling and without individual recognition? So individuals start at random positions, random orientations. There's no cheating going on here. And so I'll just show you some movies of a group of 100 individuals with 1, 5, and 10 informed individuals. And the cross just shows you the centroid, the center of the group. And one informed individual, which is colored in white here, is not able to convey the information. But 5 informed individuals, after they occupy the frontal edge of the group, do convey information, and the group kind of moves in the right direction. Not very efficiently, but information is being conveyed about that preferred direction. But with 10 informed individuals, suddenly and spontaneously, the group moves very quickly and very accurately. And so to quantify this accuracy of information transfer in a normalized way from 0, which is no information transfer, 1, which is perfect information transfer, and I should note that these agents are stochastic, there's noise in this model. You can see that for all group sizes, as we increase the proportion of informed individuals, we increase asymptotically the information transfer capability, the accuracy of communication. But perhaps more interesting is that if we look at, say, a given accuracy of information flow through the system, and we look at a small group, such as a group of 10, we need around half of the individuals to have information to convey this level of accuracy. But as groups get larger and larger, so here we just looked at a group of 200, we can see now we need less than 5% of the individuals in the population to convey the information. If we start dealing with migrating groups or cell groups where there can be hundreds of thousands, this can become an infinitesimal proportion. Yet, to the observer, to the biologist, it looks as if everybody knows where to go and what to do. Now, we've been able to test this. These are real fish. The red ones are informed, the blue ones are uninformed, and a green laser stimulus is the information. And you can see this wave of information as the informed guide the uninformed. And indeed, it's a very similar functional form as we predicted. So relatively few individuals can convey a lot of information within these types of systems. Now, so far, all of the informed individuals, all of the opinions in the population have been aligned with each other, literally aligned with each other in this case. But of course, in many groups, there can be individuals with differing opinions, as we saw in Chris's talk before. So, can these groups come to collective consensus decisions? Now, if I wanted to, if we're going to go to a pub tonight, and say 6 of you have a preference for one pub, 5 another, and the rest of you don't know Vienna, I could ask the question, you could put your hands up, I do a calculation, and I can give you the consensus. But of course, these organisms can't do this. So it turns out that what's important are the number of individuals with certain opinions, the strength of those opinions, but also the degree to which the opinions disagree, i.e. how far apart they are in space. And so I'm going to keep one group fixed to go 0 degrees. They want to move in this direction, and that's the lower dotted line. And then the other subset disagrees with them. Actually, they may not disagree with them. It might be 0 degrees, in which case it's the same model I just showed you. Everyone is aligned in their opinions. But they may disagree by 10 degrees, 20 degrees, all the way up to 180 degrees, where they actually want to go in exactly opposite directions. And I'll run thousands of simulations for each angular disagreement and show you where the group tends to go. I'll show the exact numbers don't matter shortly, but here in this example, there's 100 individuals, 5 want to go one way, and 5 disagree and want to go in a different direction. And what we find is that up to a critical difference of opinion, the group will spontaneously adopt the average of those opinions. However, above this critical point, this is not the group splitting, this is half of the time this group wins, and the entire group goes this way, and half of the time the other group wins, and the entire group goes in the other preferred direction. So we're going very abruptly from averaging opinions to deciding winner takes all, one or the other. And so if we look at this, below that critical difference, the group will move in the average direction. Now, of course, if there really is a red and a green target, the closer you move towards them, you'll actually move through this parameter space. And so they'll always reach this critical angle, and in this case, it's random, whether they'll go left or right. But what if I add one extra individual? So 1% of total group size. Again, randomly positioned, randomly oriented within the group. So now we have 6 individuals that prefer one direction and 5 the other. Well, now we see something pretty cool, which is that the group will almost always, 98% of the time, spontaneously choose the majority. So this majority decision-making, or democratic decision-making, is something very fundamental. And this occurs very quickly and accurately. And so again, if we're below that critical difference, they'll choose the average, as we saw before. But now, as soon as we reach that critical bifurcation point, they'll almost always choose the majority preferred direction. And no individual is aware of the majority. No individual is aware if anyone agrees with them or disagrees with them. The group is computing this in an emergent fashion. And so this just shows you there's an equal number that want to get to the white and the red target. The green ones are uninformed. And this time they're going to choose the red, but it's 50-50. But if I add just one extra white individual, and you can sort of see, even from this representation, the local noisy nature of the interactions, the group will almost always reach the democratically preferred consensus decision. But of course, if omega, and I'll come back to the strength of omega in a moment, the strength of opinions, if the strength of opinions is very strong, individuals become unwilling to give up, and they'll tend to split apart. And of course, these uninformed individuals could learn about this target and so forth. And we've tested this idea, including in a large football stadium in Germany, where we can make predictions about how humans in crowds, without verbal communication, will actually conform very much to this type of model. So some years later, I was thinking about this again because I hadn't really explored the role of the strength of opinions. And when I wrote the Nature paper, I sort of wrote it as, isn't it cool that this can happen despite all of those uninformed individuals? What I didn't realize at the time is actually because of those uninformed individuals. And so there are many situations in our own societies where there can be conflicting interests. But if you're on a hiring committee and you can never agree on a candidate, this can be bad for the organization. Or if individuals can never decide where to go, then they won't reach the food source. So we need to think about conflict within these types of groups. These are selfish individuals, genetically selfish as well. And so what about if there's conflict here? What's going to stop my minority just from becoming more strongly opinionated? Does that work in terms of convincing others regarding their opinion? And so again, I'm going to show you a model, a simulation model first, where I fix the majority preference to be a certain weight of their opinion. And what I do on the x-axis is manipulate the strength of the minority preference. Now, as I showed you before, if the minority has the same weighting, the same opinion strength as the majority will win. However, if the minority become more and more strongly opinionated, they begin to influence the group dynamic. 0.5 means half of the time the majority wins, half of the time the minority wins. And look, if the minority becomes sufficiently strongly opinionated, they can indeed dictate the group's behavior, admittedly at the cost of the group's increasing splitting, which again I'll come back to. But this is the case where everybody has a preference. But in many scenarios in nature, I mean, just like us, we all have different knowledge. These organisms live in fission-fusion populations. They each have different experiences. And in many cases, we may have individuals who are uninformed within the group, or who are perfectly informed, but they don't care whether they go left or right. Now, normally, people think uninformed individuals or unbiased individuals just act as a source of noise. And indeed, that's initially what I thought might be going on. But then when running these simulations, I find that that's really profoundly wrong. So now we're looking at the percentage of uninformed individuals within the group. And the minority has a stronger preference to the majority, 0.38 versus 0.3, but it's not so strong. If there are no uninformed individuals, the majority is still winning around 60% of the time. But look what happens if I put 12 or 15 stupid individuals or uninformed individuals in the group, or unbiased individuals. It pushes control to the majority. They democratize the decision-making. Now, if everybody's uninformed, of course, the group can no longer make accurate decisions. But I can increase the strength of preference of this minority further and further still. Now, with no uninformed individuals, the minority will win 98% of the time. But if I put in a small proportion of uninformed or unbiased individuals, it pushes control spontaneously back to the majority. And so I thought, this is pretty interesting, but could we have stumbled upon a general principle? Because there are many systems in nature where individuals are influenced by and influence others. There are technological systems, some of the systems we're talking about today. There are neural systems, and of course, there are social systems. So to try to address this, we wanted to move away from this model that was focused on the biology of animals and start thinking about the types of models people use in the social sciences, where we can deal with networks of interaction among individuals. So we used a very simple model where individuals are not embedded in space at all. The edges here just represent these individuals are communicating together. This one thinks red is the best outcome. This one thinks green is the best outcome. And they each have a small probability of changing each other's opinion. However, of course, individuals may not change each other's opinion. It's a probabilistic issue. And also, individuals can interact with multiple others. And all we need to assume mathematically, of course it can be more than two, all we need to assume now is if the probability of being convinced by one individual is Q, if you interact with two individuals that disagree with you, there's a slight synergy. It could be strong, but it only needs to be slight. But the probability of changing your opinion is now slightly greater than 2 times Q. This is a very conventional assumption in psychology. And now there's a higher probability, but only a probability, that this individual will change its opinion. Now, looking at 3 individuals is pretty dull, but we could simulate 10,000 individuals on a network. And what we find is if the majority and minority have equal strength of preference, the majority wins. As the minority becomes more strongly opinionated, as we saw before, the minority can dominate. So being strongly opinionated seems to be a good thing to get your own way. But again, as we saw before, if we have a certain proportion of uninformed individuals, initially nothing changes. But then we reach a tipping point where now a tiny proportion of individuals that either don't care what the outcome is or are uninformed will completely dictate what the outcome is. And the system flips from minority control back to democratic consensus, where now the strength of preference no longer matters. It's only the number of individuals with each preference. And the nice thing about this network model is that we can actually prove this result. And by we, I mean Thilo and Gervin, my mathematical collaborators. This is well beyond my own ability. And so we see the simulations as circles and the analytic model, the proof, as solid and dotted lines. And you can see there is only one stable state for the uninformed to win below that critical density of uninformed individuals. But then there's an appearance of what's called a saddle node bifurcation, and the system will flip to the stable majority state. There's also an unstable undecided state. So now we can look at this analytic model, and we have the 2 factors that are playing off against each other. The strength of the minority preference, how strongly opinionated they are, versus the numerical advantage of the majority. Like, how much of a minority is this minority? And we're looking here at the case where everybody has a preference regarding the outcome, and the minority can dominate in this black region by being strongly opinionated. But if we now introduce that critical small proportion of uninformed or unbiased individuals, I'm going to show you the region that flips over from minority control to majority control. And it's an enormous region. So dynamically, it just doesn't work to be strongly opinionated when you have this small proportion of uninformed or unbiased individuals within the network, which is quite a counterintuitive result. And so a small proportion of unbiased individuals prevents an extremist minority from dominating decision-making. And in a series of other papers, we've also shown that they increase the probability of reaching consensus. They act as a social glue that prevents these 2 opposing views from never being able to come to agreement. They massively increase the speed of reaching consensus. You think adding these individuals would add noise? Yes, it does, but it actually enhances decision-making, speed, and accuracy. And we've shown this in models of physical spin systems, in coupled oscillators. This seems to be a very general phenomenon. And it makes a testable prediction that uninformed or unbiased individuals should inhibit the influence of a strongly opinionated minority and return control to the majority, so democratizing decision-making. So we turned to our little schooling fish that we could train to have a strong or a weak preference for different colored targets, and we could ask whether this indeed is the case. And the theory predicts that a very small absolute number of uninformed individuals should have a big influence on the system dynamics. And so if we have no uninformed fish within our group, the strongly opinionated minority win, but if we put in 5 or 10 untrained, uninformed individuals, they spontaneously return control to the majority, as we predicted. And so diversity of opinion strengths, and particularly individuals that have weak opinion strengths, actually dramatically changes the outcome of decision-making. Now you might think about, what about humans in these types of scenarios? Because there are many cases where we're increasingly dealing with extremist strong opinions within human groups. And as we saw before, the sort of compulsory figure from Twitter of looking at these echo chambers, this polarization that occurs within groups. Well, unfortunately, what I hoped to talk to you about today is under embargo, so I can't talk about it. But what we've done is we've started studying polarization on networks, as well as how different political, or individuals with different political views, deal with social information when making decisions. And we're finding that really it's only the very conservatives that act as outliers within these networks, but have a considerable impact depending on the structure of the online networks in terms of decision-making accuracy. So hopefully I can talk about this pretty soon. But we have gone to try to test this idea not just with schooling fish, but with more complex social organizations such as these primates. These are wild baboons. So we've put GPS collars and accelerometers on almost all of the adults within the group. For ethical reasons, we did not put it on juveniles. And this is the very first time this has been possible for a primate group. And now you're seeing the raw data. So every second we have the location of each individual within the group. And going to these data, we found tens of thousands of events where some individuals want to go one way and other individuals disagree and want to go in a different direction. But much like the fish, the group will come to consensus almost always. And these individuals will have to give up on their preferences or lose the benefits of group living. So it's kind of amazing that we did this with wild primates, but we could actually finally test these predictions. And I should say that even though this is a very strongly hierarchical society, whether you're dominant or subordinate plays no role at all in social influence during these movement decisions. And so if you recall these bifurcation plots that I showed you before, where there's an equal number wanting to go each way and a slight majority, and we have the angular difference, we could mine this real primate data and show that's exactly what we find within the real system. And so this model, even though it's very simplistic, deliberately simplistic actually, does have explanatory value across a broad range of different systems. And so it's a very exciting time to do this type of research, especially in the wild. So at the Max Planck Institute, Martin Mikulski has developed new types of small, cheap tags. But the big problem is you put your tags on the animals, they migrate across the planet, and how on earth do you get your data back? Well, we've just put a new device onto the International Space Station. There was a spacewalk last month, which will allow us to recover these data pretty much anywhere on the planet. So a real new opportunity for us to study wild animals and to use the animals as an array of sensors to tell us about the health of our planet. So we can also instrument these animals. So the machine and the animal are sort of coming together in this particular project. And so this is some data that we've been getting from storks, where we can get every wing beat of these animals as they move. This is not a simulation, this is real data. Of course, we put graphics on it. But this is how the storks are soaring within these thermals. And of course, they need to find thermals repeatedly to make effective migrations. And just as we predicted, there are a small proportion of leaders that actually guide the groups through the migrations. And we can follow these animals, as I said, every wing beat throughout now their entire lifetimes. So we can really look at the fitness consequences of collective decision-making under natural conditions. And of course, these animals have been very strongly impacted by anthropogenic change, which is something, again, that we can study. And as I mentioned, we can do this throughout the entire lifetime of these animals for the very first time. And so all this work is happening in Constanz. Some of you may be aware of where that is. It's a beautiful city in southern Germany. It's on the border of Switzerland, so they literally left the lights on during the war, so it's not been bombed. So it's an amazing old city with a beautiful view of the Alps. Do come to visit us. We're about 50 minutes from Zurich Airport. And we're just building at the moment a new building to really break down these disciplinary barriers so we can have computer scientists, psychologists, economists, biologists working together for this new generation of understanding of collective organizations across systems, including below this building a large imaging environment, which is a 15 by 15 by 8 meter room in which we can really expand our studies of these types of organisms, including studies of humans. This is some work we've done recently with psychologist colleagues. These are real data. We're tracking the movement of the people, how they influence each other's eating decisions in this particular example. But it just highlights how this quantitative approach is not just limited to understanding humans, and it's not just about humans in online social networks. We also want to understand humans in the real world interacting and influencing each other. Thanks a lot for listening. I'll take any questions.
Yes, when you speak about process of decision making, you denote as democracy. But the democracy in animals is fair or optimal. So the votes of different fish or different mammals is equal or it's different. Maybe some strong fish can overcome several weak fish by the weight of the vote.
Well, that's exactly what we showed does not occur. And it does not occur when you have this diversity of information. If you have this small proportion of unbiased or uninformed individuals, that cannot occur. Okay? It doesn't matter if you have a stronger preference. That stronger preference cannot be manifested, as we showed in the analytic model.
Yeah, but the question not about preference, but about weight of the vote of some animals, because some animals may be not very useful for the collectives, and some can be leader or semi-leaders, and so on.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I showed you, right? So when there's no information within the group, informed individuals can convey the information to the group. But when it comes down to deciding between multiple options, once you cross that bifurcation point, then if you have the uninformed individuals within the group, it becomes democratic. You can then ask, well, is this good for the group? Because you can imagine scenarios where the minority may actually have better opinions. And so we've done a whole bunch of other evolutionary work that shows, in general, this turns out to be evolutionarily advantageous. But it could also just be an outcome of the dynamics. There's not much they can do about it. Right? This is what the analytic model and the other models show, is that this is the outcome of the dynamics. There's nothing much you can do about it.
It's just a comment I would like to make that if you read all literature from Levi-Strauss, for instance, about the hunting behavior of indigenous in the Brazilian rainforest.
Hunting behavior of what, sorry?
Of the indigenous population. He made two very nice observations. The one was that it seems that any structure is better than none. This was one interesting observation. The other one was that the role of the chief, so to say, was not to lead, but it was a safety net, in the sense that if the group had a bad hunting day, then they typically would sit down and say, boss, you led us wrongly, so we didn't get any food. So the boss was actually, insofar was doing the role to find food for the whole group on his own, which then was again compensated by social rewards, like he was allowed to have 2 women, but which then again was compensated by, if somebody in the tribe had no woman at all, then sometimes the boss would have to lend a woman to somebody. Yeah? So which is quite interesting insofar that the hunting itself is actually quite democratic in the way you describe, but if it fails, there's one guy responsible to do a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, that's reminiscent of something we're testing now. So there's a classic hypothesis in elephants that the matriarch, the elder female within the group, is this sort of source of knowledge, important knowledge. Now, this, again, a bit like the baboons, when you watch TV, it's like the dominant male decides where they go. No, that's not actually what happens. And so no one has tested quantitatively whether that's true. And so to test this, you're exactly right. One needs to look at it under at least two conditions. One where the conditions are fairly favorable, and also conditions that are very harsh. And to see whether then the information that this matriarch has comes out in a context-dependent way when conditions are hard. Now, I just don't know if that hypothesis is true or not, because no one has quantitatively tested this ever for any biological system yet. In relation to the internal group structure, we've done a lot of work, I'm doing a lot of work on this internal structure. The internal structure can, under some conditions, help, in other cases not help, depending on the reliability and the correlation of information within the environment. And so we can talk about that later. So again, you know, when one goes into the details of these systems, we have to consider the context, we have to consider the fact that the environment changes over time. And that's why it's so important for us to get these lifetime trajectories of individuals, because, you know, just observing animals in one season or one window or even 1 year isn't necessarily transferable to other scenarios. And so we really need to move to this lifetime observation of animals to address the types of questions you're talking about.
I was curious, when you make the move from fish to people, you could have uninformed people or unbiased people, but you could also have apathetic people who simply just disengage from the political process. So do you worry about that when you make the move from...
Yeah, that's critically important, because for this effect to occur, these unbiased individuals have to play a role in the decision-making. And in human societies, all too often, either individuals who are not strongly opinionated or uninformed tend to be excluded from the process or exclude themselves from the process. If they exclude themselves from the process, this effect, of course, disappears. Okay, so of course, in our animal groups, the individuals, because they want to maintain the benefits of group living, and they're not even aware, to our knowledge, that they're making a decision, always play a role. But when we look at human groups, then it's very, very important to consider what you're talking about.